Welcome. This is our third session of this new series, The Hows and Whys of Jewish Prayer. And we are hoping in this series, above all, to empower you to feel like confident in the Jewish Siddur, to know what's going on when you walk into shul. And so we will eventually be getting to classes that are very practical. But in these early sessions, we've really had to do a lot of scaffolding, a lot of big topics, big precedent-setting paradigms for Jewish prayer. And tonight is going to be the third, and I think the last of these really major paradigms, as I said, major the starting points for thinking about Jewish prayer. There are certain places you really have to start with the basics before we get into the weeds of Jewish prayer. And so I'll just remind us that in our first session, one of the big starting points is just to look at the word for Jewish prayer, tefillah. What does that word mean? How is it used? How did the ancestors mitpalel? What does that word mean? In short, we said that it was a word that meant something like intervening, going and intervening on someone's behalf, and then it transformed into intervening on your own behalf, some kind of negotiation. So that's an important kind of, you need that as a base for thinking about Jewish prayer. What is tefillah? Then last week, we took a look at what I think is the most important great debate around the origins of Jewish prayer, which was a debate that played out in the Talmud. One position being that Jewish prayer was started by our ancestors, our patriarchs. In other words, our prayer tradition goes all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. The other position was, no, Jewish prayer is there as a replacement for the sacrifices and as a replacement for the loss of the temple. And that's going to be really important for us to keep in mind, because it represents a kind of tension in thinking about Jewish prayer as a very human, conversational, goes all the way back to just the way people are kind of activity, or whether it is some kind of stand-in for this other system of worship, which was the offering of sacrifices in the temple. Okay, and so those are two major topics, and we're going to look at a major topic today. But I hope that if you're following along, you feel like we're really laying groundwork here, and already some of the ideas that we're going to discuss today will be amplified by the conversations we've already had. But I think next week we'll start to really get into the building blocks of the construction, that is, of the prayer service itself. We already got a taste of that last week when we realized that part of what they were doing in the Talmud by suggesting that the prayers had origins in either the three patriarchs or in the sacrifices was they were beginning to say, well, how many prayers are there? And when do you pray? What time do you pray? So already starting to see some of that work in, if you knew nothing about Jewish prayer and you left last week, you would know at least, oh, there are three standard Jewish prayers every day. Okay. Tonight, we're going to look at, I think, the third big, in some ways, think of this as the third intro class, and then we'll move on. And the topic tonight is such a big one. You ever feel like it's just like there's too much to say on this? We're going to be together for an hour. There's just too much to say about this topic. It's massive, and it is the Shema prayer, which is maybe the most important part of our prayers. That is, I said this last week. If someone was to ask me, I only have time for or I'm just learning Jewish prayer, what is the most important thing I can do? So I might answer, well, say the Shema once in the morning and once in the evening. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. in some ways, that's it. That's the class. Most important thing you can do in your prayer life, say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord." Say it in Hebrew, and we're going to get into this. It seems like it might be important to say it in Hebrew. Hear, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad in the morning, and once at night, boom, you fulfilled the most, in the world of prayer, if we speak in the language of Jewish obligation, that's the most heavy obligation, the most serious part of a prayer, the thing that you're really most obviously commanded to do by the Torah itself. It also is massive because it may be the most important line in the Torah, sort of for that reason, but also because of its content. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The eternal is the way I usually translate it. The eternal is our God. The Adonai is our God. And the Lord is one. Oneness. One, the God is one. Wow. That's a statement. That might be the statement of our faith. Now, what do we believe in? Well, it's always a debate, but we do believe that there's one God, right? There is a God and there aren't two. Those are some pretty basic Jewish beliefs. So Shema is huge. I mean, it takes us it's not only the most important part of our prayers, it takes us into Jewish theology. And yet, even in saying, oh, this is theology, this is an idea, this is a statement of faith, a credo, one begins to wonder whether it's actually appropriate to call it a prayer at all. There is an obligation to recite Shema. It is in our prayer book. You might call it the most important Jewish prayer, and yet, even if we listen to the language, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." And now we're all going to say that. Are we praying when we say that? And if we're commanded to say that, are we commanded to pray it or just to say it? What's the difference between those two? Okay, so it's a massive topic. It's a thorny topic. It's a little bit difficult to actually even know what we're talking about. But it also does something that for our prayer life that we really need to do and that we need to start talking about, which is to place a great emphasis on the act of reciting words. It sounds like a simple thing. What do you mean? Pray, I speak. But that's not obvious. Maybe I pray in my mind, or maybe I meditate. Why separate prayer from meditation? What is it about speaking words that matter so much in this tradition? And so we're gonna talk about massive. We're gonna try to do both of those things at night. We won't do, obviously, everything there is to do on Shema. In fact, we won't talk even so much about the laws and practices of how you say Shema. That we'll get to next week. I've already alluded to some of the basics. Once in the morning, once in the evening, we'll see some of the basics. But what I want to do tonight is to take a look at just the text of the Shema. What's in there? What is this? And then to step back for a minute and think about what I'm going to call a kind of a word revolution in Jewish prayer. Because after all, if we are moving away from sacrifices into the recitation of after all, we're going to be dealing with this book, this Sidur. How do we make that move? And one of the ways that we make that move is through the Shema. Okay. Let's say a blessing, just to bring some holiness into our space, and then we'll begin our learning. Blessing over Torah study, which ends la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, now this is a little dangerous what I'm going to do, because I have a tendency to start seeing connections and then you should see this text and this text and this text and this text, and then suddenly we're just like moving from text to text, and it's not a good class. Okay, if I err in that direction, so I have to hold myself back, because I want to just look at the paragraph of Shema. Right? That's what we should do. At least with most of our time tonight, is just look at those words, those classic words. What are they saying? What are they all about? But I want to give us a little bit of context and to see where those words appear in the Torah, not to just take them out of context, I want to give us a little bit of a running start into the Shema, and to show you that these words, these great words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one," great, but they don't just come out of nowhere. I think you'll be surprised, and I think it's important for us to see that it's as if they appear in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 6, and it's as if for several chapters, it's as if Moses is kind of prepping himself to deliver the Shema. It's as if the Shema is like, it starts rumbling earlier on in the book of Deuteronomy. So let me show you what I mean. And I'll try to do this very, very quickly, and then hopefully we'll be in textual analysis. But I think this will help us. I think this will give us a context, because otherwise, I don't know, how do we start talking about, "Hear, O Israel"? Hear what? What do you, when, where, what's going on here? Okay, so this is the source sheet for tonight. I'm going to share it on my own screen, but if you want it. And the Shema, the word, the line, the maybe, what is it that they hold up at football games? John 3:16. Like, right, is that it? So we would hold up Deuteronomy 6:4, right? That's like our Deuteronomy, like, let's go to a football game. Deuteronomy 6:4, that's where the Shema appears. But what I want to show you, which is just so striking, and even putting it together today, I was just like, wow, it turns out that Shema, even the word Shema, which means hear, is a kind of a recurring word in the chapters leading up to Shema. Okay, so Deuteronomy is Moses's book. Deuteronomy is Moses retelling the story of the Torah so far, and then giving a whole set of new laws that will apply, especially now that they're entering into the land of Israel. And remember, Moses won't go, so he's giving them all these new laws that they'll need. So that's basically what's happening in Deuteronomy. Moses reviews the story and then says, okay, now that we're going into Israel, here's what you need to know. And the review of the story is kind of chapter 1, 2, 3. Okay. Shema, remember, is chapter 6. Chapter 4, 5, and 6 are this period of almost like, it almost sounds like Moses is kind of getting ready to declare lots of great statements of faith in here. But for our purposes tonight, I just want you to see that it's not just that the word Shema appears here and there, but the very phrase, "Hear, O Israel," which is so famous to us, the very phrase "Hear, O Israel" begins chapter 4 of Deuteronomy, begins chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, and is kind of shot all the way through. So I think if we move through these and just sort of have them in our ear, then we'll be better prepared to actually analyze the Shema itself. So I just want to show you what I mean here, and hopefully this will move through fairly quickly. But okay, we are going to get down to Deuteronomy 6. Okay, chapter 6. Verse 4, there's "Hear, O Israel." Okay, but back up. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 1. And now, Moses has told the story of the journey. And now, Va'ata, Israel, and he addresses them that way. Israel, you, all the people Israel. Shema, hear. But hear what in this case? El chukim ve'el mishpatim. Hear the rules and the laws that I'm teaching you to observe, so that you may live and enter and inherit the land that the eternal, your God of your fathers, is giving you. Okay, usually translate that as ancestors. Okay, so the land that the eternal God of your ancestors is giving you. Okay, but that we wouldn't have noticed so much. And I should just say that I retranslated this to hear, but they, I think, had obey or heed. And it is true that the verb shema in Hebrew has a connotation of listen, like listen to what I'm saying, do as I'm saying, obey what I'm saying. So it's both, but it is also very much an auditory physical verb. Okay, so there it is. Here are the rules. Now, I'm gonna jump a little bit out of order. I want you to see chapter 4 begins with "Hear, O Israel," or "Hear, Israel." It's a different order here. Ata Yisrael Shema. You, Israel, hear. By chapter 5, verse 1, we already have the phrase itself, Shema Yisrael. Moses summoned all of Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel." Again, the rules and laws that I speak in your ears these days. There's that physical ear language. study them, and carefully observe them. Okay, so we're seeing a theme, like observe the laws, and we're seeing a repetition of a kind of a language. Hear this, now hear this. Okay, that was chapter 4, chapter 5. By the time we get to chapter 6, it's already familiar. It's like every chapter starts with Hear, O Israel. Okay, but let me just back up now 1 second. That was chapter 4, chapter 5. I just want to dive back into chapter 4 for a minute, because it isn't just that they start with the phrasing, but actually the language of hearing appears very prominently throughout the 2 chapters, and especially in the description of their encounter with God at Mount Sinai. Okay, and that's a big moment for us. So listen to the language of hearing, and I should say hearing as opposed to seeing. Okay, so the language of seeing is used here, but the language of hearing almost seems like it's instead of seeing. Okay, so look, this is Deuteronomy. Let's see, chapter 4. We're going back into 4, and Moses is telling them here, remember, you got to do all these laws, but also remember that, let's start here at verse 10. The day you stood before the Eternal your God at Horeb, that's another name for Mount Sinai, when the Eternal said to me, gather the people to me, v'ashmi'em et divarai, so that they can hear my words. Okay? In order they may learn to revere me and teach their children. A lot of these things we're going to see echoed in the Shema, but there's that language of hearing. And you came forward and you stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain was ablaze with flames to the very skies, dark with densest clouds. The Eternal spoke to you out of the fire. Now listen to this, just like, why is this so important? This is part of, I think, what we'll have to ask when we look at the Shema. Kol dvarim atem shomim, you heard the sound of words. Utmuna einchem roim zulati kol. But you didn't see any picture, you only heard a voice or a sound. Okay, that seems like, okay, let's keep that in mind. That seems like that has to be important once the Shema becomes the great statement of our faith. You heard, you didn't see. You encountered God, but it was a hearing encounter, and you heard words, you didn't see pictures. Okay, as we move through the chapter, we will notice there are other phrases that pop up later in our Shema, like, if you search there for the Eternal your God, you will find God. If only you seek God, b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. You will see those words again. So I hope you're getting the feeling. It's almost like chapter 4 is preparing us for the Shema, right? All right, one more longer passage. This is a kind of another kind of hortatory, big, you're going to be the great people. You got to follow these laws and it'll make you great. So let's start at 32 here. You have but to inquire about bygone ages that came before you, ever since God created the human on earth. From one end of the heaven to the other, has anything as grand as this ever happened? Or has its like ever been known? And this is the big thing that happened. Hashema'am kol Elohim medaber mitoch ha'esh? Has any people heard the voice of God speaking out of the fire? Kasher shamata ata vayichea, and as you have and you lived. Let's skip down here. It has clearly been demonstrated to you that the Eternal alone is God, there is no other. Oh, thematically, that sounds a lot like God is one. And again, you heard God's words. Okay, and it just keeps going. It just keeps going. We'll now move to the Shema, but in chapter 5, it's more of the same. The Eternal spoke these words. Now they're referring to the 10 Commandments. When you heard the voice of out of the darkness, and we have heard God's voice out of the fire. If we hear the voice of the Eternal our God any longer, we shall die. This is a repetition of the Sinai experience, but it's all about hearing. It's all about hearing. And again, what mortal ever heard the voice of the living God speak out of the fire as we did and lived? Hearing, 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 hearing. It seems to be the very foundational experience of the revelation that we had at Sinai, upon which this is all based. And it was words we heard. So now soon, when we start talking about Hear, O Israel, and these words, just know that it isn't just a throwaway line. It isn't just a new idea. It's like there's something, those are the very themes that Moses is trading in for chapters now as we head into the Shema. Okay? So now let's do it. Let's head into the Shema. This is chapter 6, and chapter 6 begins with more, I would say, there's a lot of like rhetorical flourish here. But even before the Shema, again, repeating, Ushamata Yisrael, hear, O Israel, willingly and faithfully, that it may go well with you and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as the eternal, the God of your ancestors spoke to you. So when Moses says this, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, it isn't a new thing. It isn't a new phrase. He's been saying it now again and again and again and again. And yet somehow, this is the line. This is the one that we savor. This is the one that we pluck out. This is the one we recite twice a day. So part of what I want to try to figure out with you is why this line? Why is this the phrase? Why is this the sentence? And then why is this the paragraph? Okay, so let's now read the paragraph. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the eternal is our God, the eternal is one. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha. You shall love the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. V'hayu hadvarim ha'ele. And these words, which Asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha, which I command you today, shall be on your heart, or that I command you today on your heart. You shall vishinantan levanecha, you shall teach them to your children, v'dibarta bam, and speak of them, b'shivtecha b'veitecha u'velechtecha v'derech. When you sit in your house, when you stay at home, and when you are away. This is away, but really more accurate would be, and when you walk on the road, when you walk on the way, right? Is sometimes I think the way to walk on, when you away. Okay, and then this phrase will be important. Uvishachpacha uvakumecha, when you lie down and when you rise. Just, you can, when you lie down, when you rise, that becomes useful for our twice a day recitation. Okay, we'll talk about that. And then finally, ukshartam laot al yadecha ve'yu latotafot beinenecha uchtatam al mezuzot beitecha v'sharecha. Bind them as a sign upon your hand. Let them serve as a symbol upon your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Okay, we're going to try and take this piece by piece. We'll try to analyze it all. But what we really need to pay attention to most is this line, because the truth is, this is it. And the original obligation, when the Talmud forms the obligation to say the Shema, it's this line that they insist on. Everything else is just a pylon. And in fact, eventually the Shema will not be just this paragraph, but 3 paragraphs taken from different places in the Torah, as most of you probably are familiar if you've cracked open a Siddur. But now, finally, I want to open this discussion up and try to figure out why this formulation is so important. What is it about this Shema Yisrael? And you've now seen the context. You've now seen how Shema was just sort of shot through the chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Deuteronomy. So it's a buildup that this is like a climax. And where have we gotten? What is it about that Shema that's the line? And how do you understand that line in the context of what Moses has been saying so far? Okay, so I just talked almost the whole half of the class. So now let's open it up a little bit. What is it about Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad? Why is that taken as such an important line? Do you see it as distinct from what we've seen so far? What's happening there? Okay, all right. Let's start with Florine.
Oh boy. I believe all of our senses get involved in prayer, but the reason words, sound, are more important is because it's associated with the breath of consciousness that we're given by God when we are born. And so I believe that breath is what we do when we speak.
Great.
I think that's the deeper connection to the Shema.
I can always count on Florine to go all the way down, all the way to the depths, and I love you for that, because Florine's doing. I just talked us through half the class. So Florine is thankfully just like jumping us right to the core of what's going on here, which is that speaking words, speech, the speech act is so profoundly significant in our conception of God and ourselves, right? That it's hard to overstate. God creates the world with words. That's foundational. That's first two lines of the Torah. We're already getting the power of words. And then God creates us by breathing God's breath into dirt, and we are animated by that breath. We become living, and one of the famous understandings of what it means to be a nefesh chaya, living being, is in the Aramaic translation it says ruach mamalala, a spirit of speech, a speaking spirit. In other words, that's what makes us distinct. That's what a human being is. And that is a living creature which can speak. That's, aside from parrots, that's what's distinct about us. And that is, now that we've said God speaks the world into being, that's what makes us like God. We who share God's breath. So it's hard to this language of hearing and speaking and saying and wording. Yes, Florine takes us right to the core and reminds us that this is not just some words. The speech act itself, the words themselves are so paramount in our tradition that having to recite words is a little bit like having to reenact the first divine act, right? Okay, the creative act. Okay, Ariella, can you build on that?
Well, yes, because in that time, they were idol worshipers. So it was about the seeing, and we are distinct. This is about hearing, about voice. So that's what's setting us apart.
I'm just love this group. Another brilliant theological cut to the core comment, which Ariella notices from remember, take note, you heard, you didn't see. There's no picture. It's only sound. And that's important. That's important because that's second commandment stuff, right? You can't make any form or image of me. I can't be seen. Nobody can see me and live. But guess what? This is a big surprise. Chapter 4 and 5 are repeating this big story. You can hear me and live. You can only barely live, right? You hear me and you're like, whoa, I don't want to hear anymore. That's as close. Hearing represents as close as you get to the God experience. You can't see it. That's idolatry, actually. If you think you can see God, you're making God far too concrete. So what, can you hear God? That also makes God, but that will allow. Words that's as close as we get to turning God into an actual object, tangible object. And it's not an object. It's not tangible, but it's close. So those are great comments. Okay, let's keep going. Hal and Kathy.
Yeah, my thought is more from the perspective of those who were saying the Shema, and it's, it's this clarion call, it's this public declaration. It is, this is a period when public speech was not that common. I mean, it was something special. And today we say talk is cheap, but talk, I think, public talk had much more weight, sort of in this context. So it's just this kind of, obviously you say the Shema individually, and we'll get into all of that, I'm sure, but this kind of communal affirmation has a certain power that, in our 24/7 media blitz we maybe don't appreciate as much.
Okay, excellent. Now, okay, Hal is also considering the significance of speech, but here in the social context, as opposed to the theological. But as Hal begins to kind of speak it out, what he's talking about is the way that the Shema now is a speech act to recite the Shema. And that's right. There's something powerful about this is the obligation. This is the obligation as the tradition is understanding. Your obligation is actually to say Shema Yisrael, actually speak those words. That's what matters. I just want to point out, and we're going to have to, we're going to have to continue to reckon with this as we chew on this paragraph, that for all of that truth, the truth of Hal's description of the incantation, the credo, the whatever this is, the speech act, it doesn't actually sound like that's what we're being asked to do, right? Shema Yisrael doesn't sound like you speak. It sounds like you listen. You don't speak, right? Shema Yisrael, you are the hearer of this thing. So how does that turn into you saying it? Well, the obvious place to go to start thinking about is later in the paragraph. And these words which I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them to your children. Oh, and here it is, v'dibarta bam, and you shall speak them. So speak about them, it sort of sounds like teach them, learn about them, reflect on them, but that gets turned into say it gets very meta. These very words right here, like what words? And I should say, what words? I mean, it could be that the words are all of the Torah, and yet the very kind of formalist tradition here says, no, it says these words. So these right here, say these words. And particularly that opening line, Shema Yisrael. Okay, so Hal is right that there's a kind of power to the speech act, and yet that requires a few steps. It's not so clear that that's what the Shema is asking of us. Okay, let's take a couple more comments, and then we'll dig further from Jen and then Alexandra.
Just taking what Florine was suggesting about this being kind of like a parallel of the words of creation, like to its extreme, like what that would imply is that creation, it was not a one-time event, because these ideas of speaking and hearing are repeating throughout the Torah, and that it's not a unidirectional event, that we are speaking something into being with each other, and that it has to be spoken not just by one person, but by many people, and not heard by one person, but by many people. So this idea that creation is continually unfolding, and even that something about the divine relies upon us to keep co-creating it, as well as us relying on the divine to keep sustaining us.
Yeah. That was so beautifully said. I don't want to just try to repeat it in simpler language, but I do want to extend that beautiful description of us becoming co-creators into, that's exactly the prayer paradigm that we are beginning to map out tonight, which is that words have power. Speaking words has power. And clearly because God modeled that for us, but now that we can do it as well, it changes, this is an important point. It changes what prayer might be, because it isn't just me interceding on behalf of myself. I mean, it's a radical thing to begin with to say that I can have a conversation with God. But now it's not just a conversation. Remember, we're wondering if this even counts as prayer. It's about the recitation of the words, because doing that has, and here we begin to it's the Kabbalists who really begin to articulate this. And by the time we get to the Hasidic thinkers, this is like a full prayer theology. But it's like just saying the words does something. Now, I know many modern people cannot believe that our prayers have actions, they affect. But I don't know. I'm not asking you to believe that right now. I'm just saying that's the theology, and maybe there are different ways to believe it. Maybe it's like the sound vibration, affects consciousness and shit, like who knows? I'd love to hear more thoughts on what it means that speaking words actually creates force in the universe. But that is part of the idea that we're starting to develop and introduce into Jewish prayer. Speaking words matters. Speaking words does something. It's a creative act, right? Wittgenstein would agree with that, but here it's like creative, like ex nihilo. Alexandra.
So there are lots of studies that patients who are prayed for by congregations actually do better statistically significantly than those who aren't. So that would go along with this Hasidic understanding and mystical understanding that our prayers and our words do have power. And I do especially like to look at this from a Hasidic point of view, and also going along with the reflexiveness of the word tefillah, and also the reflexiveness of the description of Noah when he walked with God, that the reflexiveness of that word is more, as I understand it, more that he walked within God and he walked with the God within himself. And so when we take that idea that God is one and we should love all of it, and I put those two sentences together. I don't love how in the tefillot they're divided up, but in the Torah they're together, that God is one and we should love it all. And we should talk about it, and we should elevate everything to that status of the divine. When we're going on our way and saying, oh, I can't find my keys, like, let me elevate that to a divine experience by praying about it, by uniting those keys, that physical experience, with the divine, by talking about it, by praying about it. And just everything is God, love everything. And it's not, to me, it's not radical, this idea of having a conversation with God, because the Torah directly tells us to like talk to God on our way, talk to God, tell your kids to talk to God. That's how I see it.
Okay, excellent. So Alexandra is taking us into the content here and we can't talk about the Shema and not reflect a little bit on, first of all, God is one. And that seems to, well, why did this get selected? I don't know. Maybe they just thought, well, that's the best phrase we've got. You want to say our whole religion in 2 words, Adonai Echad. God is one. And that's really important, the oneness of God. And then next line, and Alexandra's right, as a technical point, we'll talk about this more in coming weeks, but as a technical point, the rabbis insert a line in between Shema, and then we quietly say here, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. That's based on another story. The blessed is the name of the kingship of God forever and ever, is like inserted here as a response. So it's sort of broken up. Alexandra didn't like that because she wants to take us straight to the next line, which also, why is this the great paragraph? Well, love seems in like an important theme here too, right? The emotional experience, and I say emotional, it's on your heart, it's with all your heart. You love God so deeply with everything you have, and these words which I command you today shall be on your heart. That seems very important too, that this is like, it's not just saying words, it's saying the words that, first of all, speak to the essence of what we think God is, which either is like one and no other, monotheist, or oneness, everything is part of the same force, lots of different formulations. But in any case, God is the one. And we love God. We love God. You should love God. That's a huge, you could build a whole religion out of that, right? I think they have, actually. So loving God, that's a big part of what's going on here too. Okay, let's take a couple more comments and we'll look at the last piece of the Shema. Lori.
To me, what is really profound here is the word eternal, and how is something eternal? And it's like what the Shema is saying is you feel it with your complete soul. You teach your children, you speak it at home, you lie down, you wake up, it's with you. You show it outwardly, you bind your hand, you have a symbol on your forehead. And then the last line, which is inscribe them on the doorpost. So write it down. It's like document this and carry it forward. So there's like a past, present, forward, and it's eternal, and it's community. That's
excellent. Okay, y'all are doing the good work for me. I like Alexandra took us a couple of lines forward, looking into the emotional content, and the big line is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." And Lori likes the translation, not the Lord, but the eternal. That word Adonai, if you look at it, is a kind of like was, is, and will ever be construct. So I think literally the eternal one. So Alexandra took us into the way that you love that eternal force. Lori takes us to the last part of the Shema, where I wanted to head next, which is to really show that this paragraph does another really important thing, which is that you take these words and remember, you teach them to your children and you speak them. And there's a whole series of things you do. They're there when you're at home and when you're on the way, when you lie down and when you rise, from whence we get the idea that in the morning we say it and we say it in the evening. We'll talk more about that next week. But more than that, you also bind them as a sign upon your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. That becomes the basis for the Shema being not just spoken, but written down and put into little parchment and used as, tefillin, prayer boxes, whatever. These, you may have seen them. Wrap your arms and place on your head. Now you take the Shema, you speak it, you teach it to your children. It's always with you. You also affix it. I mean, it's strange actually that they decided to take this so literally. Find it as a sign of, but they did. You actually affix it to your head and to your arm, and on your gates. What's that? Mezuzah. Mezuzah. So now the Shema, now this is interesting. The Shema is something you incant, recite twice a day. It's something you will teach to your children, but it's also something that you will wear to a certain extent, that you will affix to your house. These words are sort of they're all around you. They're with you always, right? You just like a graffiti artist, right? Like writes the same thing over and over. It's like you have the same thing so that's also part of the experience here. And Lori is mapping that out importantly for us, because that we have to take that into consideration too. These words, at least as this paragraph has been understood, are not just the important words, they're the ones that are sort of everywhere. It's on the wall, it's on the head, it's on the arm, it's in the mouth, it's when you're walking, it's when you're sitting. It's like these words should be with you all. Now, what does that mean? Why would these words always, what is it's a little much, isn't it? Like, give me a break with these words, but somehow these are the words. And I say that knowing that, again, it isn't obvious that these words is a reference to this particular paragraph, but that's the way that it has come to be understood. So very, very well said there, Lori. Okay, let's see. I think anyone who hasn't spoken yet, just final thoughts on the Shema before we take a look at a kind of a competing force that is happening that we have to take into account of when we think about the power of words in prayer. Okay. Jane, what about you? Jane Sobo.
Okay. Let's see, two things. One is a comment, one's a question. The comment, I'll try to make it short. Just the power of words alone. Remember back in the day when someone had a birthday or an event, you had to go shopping and buy a gift for them, and it took a lot of time and thought and all that, like before internet shopping and internet registries and stuff. Well, once I surrounded myself with sort of the Pico Robertson community for a while, I noticed a trend that when birthdays came and other celebrations, people were not bringing physical gifts, but what they brought were words, and they would give blessings. Maybe the person who had the birthday would dispense the blessings to the attendees, Or the attendees would simply, at the table, impart words of wisdom and blessings. And it really was revolutionary for me once I thought about it, that the gift that we were giving in those instances were words. And the power of the word is just so vital and potent, that those are better than physical gifts.
That is a very profound reflection, Jana. I really appreciate that, because part of what you're doing, which is so essential to add to this conversation, is that the emphasis on words shapes our entire cultural being and orientation, right? We're people of the book, right?
Yes.
A scholarly people, but not just scholarly, sort of a thoughtful, idea-oriented, conceptual, right? When we say we're people of the book, part of what we're saying, or actually the Muslims came up with that for us, but we like that phrase. Part of what we're saying is, even when we didn't have land, stuff, goods, we have words, we have ideas. That's part of what makes us spiritual, is that a word is actually meaningful, even though it's nothing. It's something to us. An idea is something to us. That comes to define, first of all, who we are as human beings, as we said before, that we can talk, but not just that we can talk, that we can hear and think and process and understand. Okay. And that's a big part of who we are as Jews, right? Like particularly wordy people, right? Like, not that other religions don't have that. In fact, John, the Gospel of John picks up on this very strongly, the idea of the logos being central. But that's an important idea. In the beginning was the word. Why would you say that? Because words matter here. And they matter because they have cosmic power, but also because that's a big insight into what it means to be human, is to be able to think and hear and to appreciate a blessing, as Jane said so beautifully, as much as I might appreciate a new, well, maybe not a new car, but like a new something. I was going to say a new car, and then it's like, I pick a new car. Okay, so I have 10 minutes left. So I want to do one other thing before, hopefully I'll be able to come back to these hands, but I want to do one other thing before we close, which is to say, great, we've done some good work now with the Shema, trying to understand why this paragraph, what's so potent about this. And we will, in the coming weeks, look at how then it gets turned into a prayer and assigned to certain times of the day and the rules and all of that. But I want to just show you one other thing that's just crucial to see as we consider the power of words in our prayers, and in particular, the idea that words might be the thing that the rabbis used to replace the sacrifices. Because we had the sacrifices back in the Torah. That's the system that first Exodus and Leviticus gives us, right? And then last week we started, and then you have a temple. You get to Israel, you build the temple, you keep doing sacrifices. Last week we started to consider, part of what Jewish prayer is a response to the destruction of the temple. So they got to come up with something else. But why words? And part of what we need to see here is that the sacrificial system, which was kind of, we kind of talk about as if it was, well, that was destroyed by the Romans, so unfair, now we can't do it, boo-hoo, we have to come up with a new plan. But the sacrificial system was already being fiercely criticized long before the temple was destroyed. And here it's very important for us to turn to the great prophets of Israel, because hundreds of years before the temple was destroyed, they're already starting to say, maybe sacrifices are not the best way to connect to God. So I want us to see, there's the Shema, which as in the Torah, there's precedent for words being important, but the idea that words might be the thing that we use to replace the sacrifice, that's not just a concession. As some of the great prophets see it, no greater than Isaiah himself, that's an ideal. We want to get away from the sacrifices. And I'm just going to give you a couple of selections from the prophets that give you a sense of how they were already railing against the sacrificial system. So take a look at Isaiah here. Isaiah says, and here's the word revolution, right? The move towards words. And there are two important prophetic statements. One's from Isaiah, and this is not deep. Isaiah's 60 plus chapters long. You don't have to go all the way to the end. This is chapter 1. Okay, chapter 1. Isaiah's not hiding the ball here. Chapter 1, Isaiah says, in the name of God, Lama li rov zivchehem. Why do I need all your sacrifices? I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams, the fat of beasts, and the blood of bulls. I have no desire for lambs and goats. You who come to appear before me, ma bikesh zot miedchem. Who asked that of you? I mean, it's strong language. Who asked that? I mean, didn't the Torah ask that? But okay. Trample my courts no more. Bringing meal offerings is worthless. Incense is an abomination to me. If you don't like sacrifices, if you're out there thinking ick sacrifices, don't worry, you're in great company. The prophet Isaiah, the new moon and the Sabbath, proclaiming of solemnities, assemblies with iniquity, I cannot abide. Your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They are become a burden to me. I cannot endure. I hate sacrifices. Oh, wow. It's just like, what a radical, this is like, it takes a prophet. And when you lift up your hands, and I will turn my eyes away from you, though you pray at length, I will not listen, for your hands are stained with blood. Now, this is a little bit of a play on words. They're stained with the blood of sacrifices, but what he really means is that they're stained with the blood of your bad deeds. So wash yourselves clean, put your evil doings away from my sight, cease to do evil, learn to do good, devote yourself to justice, aid the wronged, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow, join Ikar. This is it. This is Ikar Torah right here, right? Like, it's not about all your ritual stuff. It's like justice, do justice in the world. Now, that's important to see that Isaiah is already saying sacrifices, schmacrifices. That's a terrible system. We don't like that system. Disgusting. As if God is saying, I hate them. But let's just not get carried away, because Isaiah, he's really just critiquing prayer, right? Like, his replacement for sacrifices is acts of goodness, which is important to remember as well. But it's another prophet, Hosea, who lived at the same time as Isaiah. Hosea, who famously, he comes up with the formula that sets the stage for words to replace sacrifices. So it's as if Hosea gives us the theology that the Shema is going to slide right into, because the Shema has been waiting all along. Okay, so these are the famous words of Hosea the prophet. It's shorter, but this is really, really critical. This is like prayer 101 here. This is like really important passage. Shuva Yisrael, return, O Israel, ad Adonai Elohecha, to the eternal your God, ki kashalta bavonecha, because you've fallen because of your sin. Ku imachem dvarim, take words with you. Take words with you, v'shuvu el Adonai, and return to the eternal. Imru alav, say to God, kol tisa avon v'kach tov, forgive all guilt and accept what is good. And here's the very famous phrase, unishalma farim sfatenu. Instead of bulls, we will pay with our lips. It should say pay with our lips. But really what that means is, we will nishalma, we will pay what we gave forth with bulls, we're now going to give words instead. Okay? Now we're going to give words instead. And this becomes the touch point upon which the rabbis will begin to construct a new theology to justify a new theology of prayer, which is not just that you have to recite the Shema, and not just that, well, what are we going to do? We don't have sacrifices anymore. We gotta say something, I guess. That's the best way. But no, that actually words are in some formulations just as good as prayers. Take a look at this is now rabbinic text here. The Midrash Tanchuma says, oh, the Holy Blessed One forgives the sin of Israel, because the Holy One says, if you have a bull, bring a bull. If you have a ram, bring a ram. If you have a sheep, bring a sheep. But if you don't have any of those things, take words with you. And they're still wondering, will they be accepted? Yes, because Hosea said, Nishalma parim sfatenu. Okay, that's a kind of, oh, words are good enough, but soon enough, Rabbi Elazar says, prayer is greater than offerings. Gdolat tefillah yoter min hakarbanot. And here he's going to quote Isaiah, as it says, what do I need with all your sacrifices? Okay, so that was a little bit of a quick tour, but you can see that there's a critique embedded in Jewish tradition that once the temple is destroyed, there are all these voices that are there to say, who needed the temple anyway? It was barbaric, or it was ritualized, or it was corrupt. Lots of different critiques we could offer of the temple. Our time is growing short. But one way or another, there are prophets long before the destruction of the temple that saw that system as inferior. And Hosea at least provides us with the template that the rabbis are going to build upon to say, if that's an inferior, what is the superior form of prayer? Words, 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 words. Okay, so that's like that we really have to understand in order to move forward in Jewish prayer is the power of words and the way that words came to seem in the first prophetic and the rabbinic mind like this is what we'll offer God. So it isn't just conversation, it isn't just intercession. It's look, I'm giving you God my word. Look here, you can have my word. That's an offering to you, and that's a new paradigm. Okay. Let's see if we can do just a few last comments before we close. I'm going to turn to Susan and yeah, Susan, what are you thinking?
A very quick comment and a question I've had for a long time. The comment is that most of the idol worshippers and early religions believed in sacrifices, and that is possibly another reason why they turned to words, because words often are a higher intellectual thing. And
yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, Susan. I think that's an important, that evolution or development, I don't know how you'd call it, that's an important thing to track as well, because it is possible, and certainly someone like Maimonides looks at it the way you do, Susan, that to see this as an evolution, that, yeah, I mean, Maimonides says famously, why did they offer sacrifice? That's just what they knew how to do. That was the highest form of worship in the ancient world. So the idea was take sacrifices and redirect it from idolatry to God. But, says Maimonides, but that's not the highest form of worship. That's like gross, barbaric. That's an ancient form. It's really an idolatrous form of worship, actually. And eventually we have to move past. So Maimonides would see, and I think Susan does too, this is a step forward, an advancement in prayer life, right? And then we can begin to wonder, well, where does prayer go from here? And in fact, in some places, Maimonides seems to suggest, or especially Maimonides' son writes, that eventually we'll move to the point where we don't even have to say words. We'll just think our prayers, because then it's a new stage of refinement and development. But whatever, we're not there yet. I keep seeing Allison's hand go up and down. Is she around? I want to give her the last comment. Are you there? Yes, she is.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you. I didn't want to take up too much space, and I came late, so I hope this wasn't already said, but first of all, this class is so lovely. Thank you so much. And this whole class, I keep thinking about like the very first words of Genesis, like the fact that we're speaking, and this idea that, like we're created in the image of God. And like, what is God? God like speaks things into existence. So in some ways, the fact that we're speaking it is so powerful, because maybe by speaking it, we help make it true.
Yeah, very beautifully said. And I think that's a great note to end on, because we said before, God creates the world with words. So there's something God-like about speaking out words, something about the fact that we can speak that makes us somehow more like God. It speaks to the power of words. But as Allison is formulating it, it's like, and this becomes a classic formula in Jewish prayer, this maybe is an insight into why we say Adonai Echad, God is one. Because by saying it, we create that reality. In other words, we unify God. We give voice to, we speak out, just as God spoke out us, now we speak out God. And the Kabbalists speak of this, liyached kutchebrichu shchintot, to unify God. So saying the Shema is unifying God. If it has a creative power, then maybe that's what it's doing, is we are actually enforcing, endorsing, but maybe even actually somehow supporting the unity of God in the world. Like, not by speaking that out, it comes to be true. So I think that's very.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Just as you were speaking, it made me think about Torah itself. You know, like there's this idea that God is one, and so we're speaking it, and maybe that has, you know, we're creating something. But it made me think about how we have this idea that like Torah is holy, and so we read it, but then maybe by reading it, we make it holy.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's like a continuous cycle.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, there's this constant interchange. You know, one big reference point that we can use, we've been using, is creation. God speaks the world into being. But the other great reference point, and we saw it in those early chapters of Deuteronomy, is Mount Sinai. And what a crazy thing that we finally merit to stand before the creator of heaven and earth. We have the most profound encounter with God, according to our tradition, that ever was. And what is the form in which it takes place, it manifests? Speech, words. God manifests to us in words. Words are like the medium through which we can be connected to God. Words which are neither physical nor spiritual. They hover in that place between heaven and earth. Okay? All right, so that's a great sort of thought to end on. I thank you for that, Allison. And just a teaser for where we're going next time, just to give you a sense of how important this discussion really is. The Talmud opens. This is the opening of the Talmud. The very first words of the Talmud are Me'ematai korin et Shema ba'arvit. When do we recite the Shema in the evening? And you won't be surprised if you've been studying with us now that they're going to connect it to the rituals of the temple services. Okay, so that you can see them already starting to do that work. But just look at the fact that the Shema, the recitation of the Shema, was the very first thing that the Talmud ever thought to talk about. So if that doesn't give you a sense of the importance of the Shema in our tradition, I don't know what would. So that's a teaser. We will pick up right there where we left off and start to see how the rabbis then, given all the theology that we've been processing so far, how they begin to build. Okay, so now we got a Shema, now we got an Amidah. What's the Shema going to look like? How are we going to recite it? How are we going to assemble them? We begin to do that work next week. All right, thanks everybody, and good night. Thank you for a wonderful discussion.